Well, welcome everybody to our third in a series of 4 different 9/11 panels at the Left Forum 2015. This is a first. We're very excited about it, and we've got a team of dedicated people who have stayed with it and amassed a very good set of panels for the purpose of including the message here in the whole dialogue this year of this Left Forum event. And the dialogue being that of the necessity to continue to evaluate the consequences of 9/11. Why? Because it's necessary if we're going to be redirecting our future from the trajectory that we've been on. So, and it's going to, this panel is going to involve looking at the consequences as well as looking at a major development that's happening on the legislative level, which we feel, many of us feel, can be a major solution to the, or a major, I would say, accomplishment in the journey that we've been on for the last 14 years to address all the anomalies and the what we feel is a grand deception about the events of 9/11. So we'll be talking again about some details about the consequences of this aftermath that we've been subjected to for the last 14 years and a major development that's happening on the legislative level. If you all can see this, here's a list of some of these consequences. Right. Wars for empire, the Patriot Act. I hope does anybody not know of the stated agenda that was laid out by the Project for a New American Century in their document called Rebuilding America's Defenses? Does anybody not know of this? Okay. Okay.
We got the choir.
Yeah. Well, we have the choir, but it's good to know that this information has really been disseminated. The main phrase here is the need for catastrophic catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor to justify the agenda by Project for a New American Century to in their words, to transform our military. And so one of the very, very clear consequences of 9/11 is how much do we spend every year as a result of 9/11 on the military? I think the U.S. outspends all other nations combined. Okay. Devastating consequence. To the right, the Patriot Act. And we'll touch on this later because does everybody know that the Patriot Act is up for renewal, right? June 1st, tomorrow. And there's some pretty interesting developments there. And what's been, I think, very, very positive to see that it hasn't just been a shoo-in. It hasn't just been a rubber stamp. There's been a challenge. So there's kind of a revolt going on there in Congress over the continuation of the Patriot Act. The surveillance state, torture policy. I'm just going to read through these. The bulk data collection that's been going on, which is, I hope everybody's watching this. It's very, very Orwellian, and with the technology that's being used, it's just all invasive. And again, full spectrum dominance, which is the term that Project for a New American Century used. And if we just look back over the last 14 years, full spectrum dominance means, right, having the most powerful military where no other nation could even dare to rival us. Also means the militarization of space. It means also the militarization of the U.S. within our own borders. It's full spectrum. This is exactly what we've witnessed. It should be clearer than ever. The clash of cultures. There was a panel yesterday on the dangerous development of Islamophobia. This is what I'm referring to here in the clash of cultures and what we see going on in the Middle East now with ISIS and the attempt to set up a caliphate and the threat that all represents to the rest of the world, and the intersectarian rivalries going on. There's just a clash of cultures that's all been unleashed here as a result of 9/11. The militarization of the police at home couldn't be more clear over the last couple of years here, where the police are driving Humvees and other military vehicles, have tanks and sophisticated hardware, military hardware, all is a surplus thanks to the ratcheting up of military output. And it's like, so our own police departments are now looking like occupying forces. Economic decline, right? When $4 trillion are spent on the military and military pursuits, and that's according to Joseph Stiglitz, economist, $4 trillion that could have been used for building our own infrastructure, for education, for healthcare, for all other domestic uses. This is a cost that is just devastating to the general American public. Crackdown on whistleblowers. We've seen this in a continued fashion here, where the most recent one being where John Risen, right, James Risen, journalist, getting threatened with jail time for his book, State of War, I believe it is.
At any price.
At any price, that's one of his books, and I think his previous book where he included this information by, it was almost inadvertent, by a CIA agent over the plot to give Iran faulty nuclear plans, nuclear development plans. And so that's just the latest one here, but you know, that's a whole topic in and of itself. We have reports by Tom Drake and William Binney and others, Russell Tice, and of course, you know, Snowden, Edward Snowden, and his whole experience. So the list just goes on and on. It's a dangerous, dangerous, you know, situation for anybody within government wanting to blow the whistle on corrupt and criminal activities. Censorship of the media. I'll leave that to the gentleman next to me to address for sure, and he's welcome to address as many others as you'd like here. Also, growth of domination by the corporations. I mean, Trans-Pacific Partnership, you know, they're able to operate and move forward in secrecy, which is all part of the systemic infrastructure of government. And you know, what they are doing is instituting laws, right, where any challenge to their bottom line, where you know, protesters have been, they can and have been accused of being terrorists. If you protest corporations, whether it's the agricultural corporations, you know, the meat industry, of course, the fracking industry, you're at the threat of being labeled terrorist. It's all part of the atmosphere of the aftermath of 9/11. The constant fear campaign. Remember all of the releases of tapes saying, oh, bin Laden has released such and such information, and it was like every 6 months there would be a release of some tape. you know, it just, whatever it is, it's a constant way to keep the American public in a state of tension and anxiety. And since the rise of the latest, quote, brand of terrorists, according to Sybil Edmonds, it used to be Al-Qaeda, right, for many years, and then they'd come up with this, that, and the other organization. Now, of course, ISIS. It's just a constant fear campaign where anybody watching mainstream news, they're telling us there's the threat of another, quote, 9/11-like attack. Then what we have here is the evisceration of the rule of law, whereby there are crimes of state that get committed of all sorts that have yet to be indicted and prosecuted. I mean, that's a whole topic, the evisceration of the rule of law. I mean, look at how the Constitution is violated left and right, whether it's through acts of corporations, the process of ramming through the TPP, or the process of incarceration in Guantanamo Bay, and the Military Commissions Act, and all these acts that were completely unconstitutional. Government immunity from war crimes. I think this is one of the biggest, most serious consequences in that that when there is a state of war, the U.S. government can do basically anything, including institute a torture policy, which is what we've just seen since 9/11, and attempt to use their lawyers to justify it legally, even though knowing that it's totally in contradiction to the Nuremberg principles, even knowing that torture is actually ineffective and counterproductive, yet it has been done, it's been instituted. Now, this is something where this immunity situation is so so destructive, and I would think that the entire left would be very sensitive to this, where the state of war is actually required so that the U.S. government and the powers that are manipulating it can do what they've been doing for the last 14 years. Because historically, we can look at World War II, how the Japanese were put into internment camps, violation of their rights, but what they claim is, again, state of war, and in a state of war, the Constitution can be ignored, and rule of law can be suspended. So I think this is a very serious consequence of 9/11, and so there's an awful lot here that hopefully the left can and will consider as rationale for really understanding 9/11 for the agenda that it represented, and I'll go into that a little bit later. I just want to do a brief overview later about 5 categories of 9/11 related research that just will break it down to a very simple understanding. And from there, I think there should be no doubt that we are in a position to have a very good foundation to question 9/11 for what it is, understand it for the agenda, and then start to take action from here to the point where we can raise the level of consciousness throughout the general public and on the legislative level that this historic act, with the most consequential act of our time, can and must be brought to the highest level of debate. Okay. Now, one individual that is done an awful lot of research. It comes with an awful lot of the types of credentials and scholarship that really brings an awful lot to the table is my guest, Mark Crispin Miller. Mark is a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. Mark is author of Boxed In, The Culture of TV, the Bush Dyslexicon, Observations of a National Disorder, Cruel and Unusual, Bush Cheney's New World Order, and Fooled Again, and also The Real Case for Electoral Reform. Did anybody see the film Rolling in Orwell's Grave?
Orwell rolls in his grave.
Orwell rolls in his grave.
I want to.
Orwell rolls in his grave. Very good. This is Mark's film, and very important work on one of the major consequences of 9/11, which is the crackdown on civil liberties. So we are very happy to have Mark with us, and Mark, take it away.
Take it away. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Well, of course, we want to bring this subject to the public and debate it at the very highest levels. Naturally, we do. I mean, there's no question but that a lot of really bad shit has happened since 9/11. As you've made clear going through every category of it, it seems glaringly obvious that it's happened. So why is it that it's not being debated nationally, and why is it that the left isn't talking about it? Because it isn't, and I'm not as sanguine as you are about the possibility of that happening, and my assignment here today is to talk about why that is. You know, why it's not being debated and why so much of the left won't talk about it. It is good news that there are 4 panels here on this subject. That's a definite step forward. Let me add that 9/11 is on everybody's lips by contrast with the problem of election fraud and stolen elections, which is completely taboo. And I'm going to be talking on that at a 3:40 panel later today with Bob Petrakis, who's over there. So I urge you to come to that as well, because the theft of elections in this country is inextricably related to 9/11. If Bush Cheney hadn't stolen that election, 9/11 wouldn't have happened. Well, I don't want to get lost in the weeds here. Let me begin by reading to you a recent bit of a recent movie review that takes a shot at me. Okay, and this isn't just grandiosity or self-advertising. You'll see that it's directly related to the subject that we're dealing with today. This is from a review of a new documentary called The True Cost, which is about fashion. It's just coming out now. This review ran in the Daily Beast. It's written by a fashion writer named Lizzie Crocker. She goes through the film and then she writes this: materialistic, money-grubbing Americans shouldn't kid themselves. All of that stuff they're buying is making them depressed, despite the promise of happiness and consumerism that the advertising industry is selling us. So much for the American dream. But this is where the film loses focus and credibility, criticizing not just the fashion industry, but the global capitalist system that supports it. NYU media professor Mark Crispin Miller denounces advertising as sinister propaganda. Scare quotes around propaganda and sinister. Quote, this is me, we think of propaganda as a totalitarian thing. We think of Hitler, but propaganda is actually as American as apple pie. Miller tells us. I think that's an uncontroversial observation. And in fact, the Daily Beast put that quote in a box at the side of the review. Okay, so clearly it's something people will read and say, yeah, right? But Lizzie Crocker begs to differ. The film neglects to mention that Miller is a 9/11 truther, a once respected writer and political activist whose views have become too fringe for even the most extremist pockets of the mainstream. Yeah, right, what? I didn't know there were any extremist pockets in the mainstream, much less most extremist pockets of it. Whatever, however demented they are, I'm too psychotic even for them, okay? By including people like Miller, the film presumes that its target audience is both ignorant and impressionable. Either we won't recognize Miller as a conspiracy theorist, or we will, but are too open-minded to dismiss his opinions about advertising. Yeah, just try to process that, okay? They're not opinions, you know. It's a historical fact. Advertising is a form of propaganda. It's commercial propaganda. And into the 30s, in the advertising trade press, you'll find the word propaganda used by people in advertising to refer to what they do. Okay? But it's an opinion, and it's an opinion that on its face should be rejected, out of hand, especially because of my background as a 9/11 truther. Okay? Now, there's a few things to say about this. One is that this is a kind of minor historical point, but it's worth making, that the charge of conspiracy theory is a kind of descendant of red baiting, right? Because her entree to this attack on me and on the film for using me is the fact that the film is not content simply to take issue with advertising, but it actually raises questions about the global capitalist system that supports it. Okay? Therefore, the film has to be condemned and so on. But the more important point is that, Lizzie Crocker is not at all unusual in her readiness to level this charge against me, even though I wasn't talking about 9/11 in the film. And even though I'm not actually, by any stretch of the imagination, a full-time 9/11 truther. I mean, I speak at events like this. I'm very sympathetic, but I can't pretend to be on the same level with, people like Les and David Ray Griffin and so on. Nevertheless, the fact that I'm open to this at all is grounds for complete and utter condemnation, no matter what I'm talking about. So, the bigotedness of this response is startling, but more important than that is the fact that it comes to her fingertips so readily. And that's the problem that we're up against. We're up against the problem of the conspiracy theory meme, okay? That anyone who talks about this is self-evidently nuts. But this is just crazy on its face that this would ever happen. I am confident in saying that Lizzie Crocker has never spent a second looking into the evidence that 9/11, well, I'm not even going to say 9/11 was an inside job. I'm simply going to say the copious evidence that the official story is preposterous. We can say that we can all agree, okay? The official story is preposterous. There is an enormous and ever-growing library of hard evidence to that effect. So why aren't we all talking about this? Why are the American people not discussing this? Why isn't this headline news? Why isn't there another commission planned? Which is the whole point of the 9/11 Truth Movement, is another commission. That's all it is. Okay? Precisely because that is a reasonable request and something that wouldn't be difficult to arrange, it is necessary to demonize the people who are asking for it. Now, conspiracy theory. my own career was indeed derailed. Lizzie Crocker's right about the fact that I once had entree to NPR radio shows. I talked often, 'cause I was writing about so-called popular culture, you know. I wrote about TV. So reporters would always call me up to ask me what I thought of Britney Spears or, you know, some bullshit like that. And advertising and so on, you know, harmless subjects. When I published Fooled Again, which argues that the 2004 election was stolen, as the expression has it, I couldn't get arrested. Although it's an unfortunate expression because who knows, right? But what I mean is I was blacklisted. The book was blacked out. I got 2 newspaper reviews in the whole country, 1 positive, 1 negative. I could not get any interviews on NPR. A friend of mine who has a small foundation in Philadelphia offered to put up the money to pay for ads for the book that would run on WHYY, which is the Philadelphia NPR affiliate. And they said, sure, we do that all the time. So he and I wrote some 30-second spots about the book, and he sent them in, and he didn't hear back. He followed up with a phone call, and they said, well, no, see, we don't really do political advertising, I said to him. He said, we're not asking you to do political advertising. Mark Crispin Miller isn't running for office. He wrote a book about the 2004 election. And the reply to that was, we're not going to just advertise any book. I mean, we wouldn't advertise Mein Kampf.
What?
Yes. We wouldn't advertise Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf. Okay? All right. So, you know, I was a conspiracy theorist. Everybody who wrote about the issue was a conspiracy theorist. What I went through, Bob went through, Steve Freeman at Penn, is he? Went through, Bobby Kennedy Jr. went through. It's a conspiracy theory. No matter how well argued, no matter how amply documented, we're talking about conspiracy theory. It can't be true. It's not possible. They wouldn't steal an election, not in this country, okay? They might do it in Russia or in Venezuela, but they're not going to do it here. It is self-evidently preposterous. Okay, I was so stunned by this because it was a major mainstream publishing house that did the book. It was Basic Books. And I even hired, as an outside publicist, Barbara Montero, who was Paul Krugman's publicist, and who has had much experience in getting people on shows like Charlie Rose and that. And she'd never seen anything like the brick wall that she ran into with Fooled Again, okay? Now, I tell you all this, I'm not whining to you. I'm telling you this to explain why I decided to research the origins of that meme, conspiracy theory. When did that start? You know, where did that come from? Because the fact is, it's a fairly recent development. And I was in touch with Lance DeHaven Smith, as a name some of you may know, who had written a great essay on conspiracy theory. So I asked him to write a whole book on it for a series I was editing, published by the University of Texas Press. And I strongly recommend the book to you if you haven't read it. It's called Conspiracy Theory in America. And what it demonstrates is the following. Until 1967, the phrase conspiracy theory rarely came up in American journalistic discourse. If you do a search in the archives of the New York Times, Washington Post, and Time magazine, do a search on the phrase conspiracy theory, you find that it's rarely used, and when it is used, it's used in various ways, in various contexts. There's nothing consistent about its use. Suddenly, in 1967, it starts appearing all over the place, and increasingly, through the rest of the 60s and into the 70s and ever since. And it's always used in the same way. Well, I should say about 90% of the time, it's used in the same way. It's used to discredit, arguably, left critiques or discussions of state crimes against democracy. Okay, not just 9/11, but the Kennedy assassination, the Kennedy assassinations, I should say, Martin Luther King, Iran-Contra, the CIA's drug dealing in the inner city, election fraud, and latterly the Boston Marathon bombing. We could go on, okay? We could do another one of these. To put up on screen a list of all the stories that have been dismissed as conspiracy theory, it would be striking. Okay? Now, this is how it started to be used. In 1967, the CIA sent a memo to all of its station chiefs worldwide, and the memo is in the back of Lance's book. The occasion of the memo was the fact that a couple of books had come out questioning the findings of the Warren Commission. One was Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, so kind of a left critique of the commission. The other was Edward J. Epstein's Inquest, which is a sort of right-wing critique because he argued that, Castro was behind the assassination. It doesn't really matter what the arguments were. The fact is that there were books out now questioning the commission. The CIA, therefore, had been ordered to swing into action, clearly, and urged that all these personnel, these agency personnel, now use their propaganda assets and friends in the media to discredit the work of these conspiracy theorists by making the following 5 arguments. It actually lays out arguments to be used. One of them will be familiar to you all. Well, if there were a conspiracy, someone would have talked by now. Okay? Now, in the election reform movement, we hear this all the time. Well, if election was stolen, somebody would have talked. Well, lots of people have talked, and some have even lived. People have talked all over the place. But it doesn't matter. It's not the truth of the argument that matters. It's just its rhetorical efficacy. See? Use these arguments. And then on the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, we saw that these arguments were used again. They came up again. People actually still arguing with their bare faces hanging out that Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK alone, which is a ludicrous narrative. It's as ludicrous as the official 9/11 story. It's as ludicrous as the argument that Bush Cheney won the 2004 election because the Christian vote came out. The Christians suddenly, started to multiply like Jesus' loaves and fishes and voted in huge multitudes that no one knew existed, and then he was reelected despite his record disapproval ratings and his unpopularity within the Republican Party and so on. That doesn't really matter. Fact is that the official truth is the truth, regardless of what you may say against it, and anything you say against it or say to question it is a conspiracy theory. It comes from the CIA. I would argue that it is probably the most effective propaganda drive in American history, maybe even world history. Because as Lance points out in his book, what it has done, is to effect a profound change in the worldview of the American people, who since the revolution have always been ready to believe that elites are capable of conspiracy against the rights and property of the American people. That is not a radical assumption. That's a common sense view. The Declaration of Independence is a conspiracy theory from beginning to end. That's what it is. The idea that elites were after us, that they couldn't be trusted, that they were in cahoots with the British Empire and so on. This was common currency under Andrew Jackson, and through the 19th century. You find it in the writings of Abraham Lincoln. It's just not that radical an idea. Moreover, it is a kind of natural and healthy suspiciousness that is essential to the maintenance of democracy. You see? When you internalize this idea that there's something crazy about the thought of the elites conspiring like this, when you internalize that idea, you are crippled. You are incapacitated, You can't any longer talk honestly about what's going on and what the framers understood would happen. You spoke about how the state of war has had all these dire effects. Well, that's why the framers, and I'm not idealizing the framers. I mean, they in their own way they conspired against the common people and so on, and they defended slavery. We know all this. Nevertheless, they were classical small R Republicans. They knew that you had to limit presidential power. You couldn't give the president power to declare war. You couldn't and shouldn't have a standing army. Compare that vision with what we have today, right? With this grotesque, distended military establishment that's both public and private, with a president who makes war constantly. I think this is the most warlike president we've ever had. The fact is that right in the American tradition, there has always been a kind of salutary distrust of executive power that's kind of vanished now. Because when people notice that something's fishy about a story that they've heard, they are always inclined to apologize by saying, well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but. You've heard people say this, right? Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but. Then they'll say something perfectly reasonable that anybody would say. But you have to, it's like, I'm not a feminist, but. You've probably heard that too. Not a feminist, but. Okay.
Mark,
Yeah.
on this topic, this is so vital, and you're doing such an amazing job covering this. The left
I'm only half done.
has I feel, been neutralized by this, as you laid out, the plot by the CIA to, quote, weaponize the term. It has been used as a tool, as a weapon to this day. It has politicians, it has journalists in a state of fear, basically in an open-air prison that from which they must stay within for fear of loss of career or worse. And so this term, unfortunately, the left, I feel, has also been greatly restricted by, especially when it comes to the events of 9/11.
May I?
I'm setting it up for you.
You're setting it up for me?
Yeah.
Okay, God bless you.
And so could you address this
Yeah.
in the cost
Yeah.
of this
Definitely.
restriction, the cost
It's all coming.
of how?
Okay, I hear you.
Great.
Okay. American history is in many ways a series of provocations, strategic provocations, like 9/11, although that's in a class by itself because it's so horrific. So, the point I just made is that ideologically and philosophically, the 9/11 truth movement is actually as American as apple pie. Okay? Moreover, even a cursory awareness or understanding of American history allows us to recognize that this tactic of deliberately inflaming public opinion by arranging a provocative act goes all the way back to the Mexican War in the 1840s. When James Polk deliberately sent General Zachary Taylor to Mexico and get the Mexicans to attack so that we could counterattack. This is arguably what happened to bring on the Spanish-American War when the Maine blew up, the battleship Maine. And there's a tape of Bobby Kennedy actually discussing the explosion of the Maine during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he refers to it just in passing as a deliberate provocation by the U.S. FDR's record, we've talked about Pearl Harbor, and this is extremely upsetting to Democrats and liberals generally, and I understand why it is. But Pearl Harbor was not the only provocation that FDR, he was also, they were chasing U-boats all over the North Atlantic trying to get them to attack our ships. And Hitler was not going to take the bait because he didn't want to fight two wars at once, not because he was a great guy, okay? Even though I am, of course, on a par with Hitler. My books are so similar to his works, you can tell. And then we all know about the Gulf of Tonkin. That's something that we can instantly think of. After the Cuban Revolution, the personnel in Guantanamo began a series of provocations, including the abduction and murder of at least 4 Cuban nationals. The number of provocations by the U.S. military personnel at Guantanamo eventually numbered over 13,000. Cuba kept, complaining about this to the UN. The Cubans weren't going to give them the benefit of succumbing to a provocation, okay? So this is something that's happened time and time and time and time and time again, and since 9/11, we've seen this happen repeatedly with the anthrax mailings and I believe the Boston Marathon bombing and Charlie Hebdo. I mean, we can go on and on. Now let me read you a passage from the Nuremberg Diary by G.M. Gilbert, who was an American psychiatrist who was assigned to Nuremberg prison. And he interviewed all of the accused, and one of them was Hermann Goering. And they had this fascinating exchange. "Why, of course the people don't want war," Goering shrugged. "Why should some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship." Gilbert is troubled by this, and he says, I mean, I could kiss the guy. Bless his heart. It's heartbreaking. He says, "There is one difference," I pointed out. "In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives. And in the United States, only Congress can declare wars." Right? "Oh, that is all well and good," Goering replies. "But voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country." Okay? It's not controversial. Now, where's the left in all this? Okay? The more persuasive the 9/11 truth movement becomes, and the more people go online and pick stuff up that the mainstream media doesn't want them to know, and the more young people come of age unintimidated by the conspiracy theory meme, that's very important. I've noticed this in my own classes. It keeps me going. It's like homophobia. I mean, they don't really care, They'll kind of look at the evidence and have a normal, sane reaction to it. The easier it gets, the more promising our prospects, the more the state ramps up their drive against us, kind of slanderous and subversive efforts to cripple the movement. You may know that David Cameron last fall, in a speech before the UN, said that conspiracy theory is as dangerous as ISIS. Okay? And he meant what we're doing, conspiracy theory. Recently, François Hollande, the socialist president of France, equated conspiracy theory with Nazism. Because, of course, anti-Semitism is based on an ancient conspiracy theory of, Jewish machinations, etc., And here in our own country, as I'm sure you know, because the choir is here, Cass Sunstein, who was working for President Obama, co-wrote a piece for a journal published by Harvard University on cognitive infiltration that is using trolls deliberately to subvert discussions of 9/11 online. I mean, he actually talked about the necessity of disabling this dangerous terroristic discourse by using agents to go online posing as sympathizers, picking fights. I have no doubt also people will go on a 9/11 site and start talking about the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Jewish world conspiracy, so that the 9/11 movement gets tarnished with a kind of neo-Nazi brush. I mean, if I were doing this kind of thing, that's what I would do, right? So, you know, this isn't just empty words we're talking about. This is a kind of manifest preparation to criminalize the kind of discussion we're having and to use all the powers of the state to shut it down. Now, where's the left? Where's the left in all this? Where is it? Let's go back to 67 when the CIA sent out this memo. Right around the same time, Ramparts, you know, the leftist magazine, was breaking these amazing stories about what the CIA was up to. In 66, they broke the story of how Michigan State University had played a crucial role in propping up the Diem dictatorship in South Vietnam. A professor at MSU, Stanley Scheinbaum, blew the whistle on this because he was actually involved in the program, and he realized they were training police at Michigan State University. This was broken by Ramparts. The following year, they broke the story of the National Student Association being subsidized by the CIA. That story exploded in the mainstream press. The New York Times did an excellent job following up on that story, interviewing kids who had unwittingly been dragged into the CIA operation, threatened with long federal jail terms if they told anybody about it. I mean, it was really harrowing. I cannot imagine anything like that happening now. I don't see the left any longer doing those kinds of exposés. And I believe that if you study the history of the New York Review of Books and The Nation, even the New York Times Book Review, and other publications like that, do a content analysis of those publications from then through the 70s and to now, you'll see that this kind of explosive content just stops. It stops. We don't see it anymore. And now we've come to the point where some of our most illustrious fellow leftists actually go out of their way to disavow any kind of discussion like the discussion we're having. I'm going to read you, I'm concluding with this. This is a passage from Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein, a work that's the subject of a panel here at the Left Forum, a book that I deeply admire, and I think the world of her. I mean, she's kind of a friend of mine. Nevertheless, I am struck by this passage. When the September 11th attacks hit, the White House was packed with Milton Friedman's disciples, including Donald Rumsfeld. The Bush team seized the moment of collective vertigo with chilling speed, not, as some have claimed, because the administration deviously plotted the crisis, but because the key figures of the administration, veterans of earlier disaster capitalism experiments in Latin America and Eastern Europe, were part of a movement that prays for crisis the way drought-struck farmers pray for rain and the way Christian Zionist end-timers pray for the rapture. When the long-awaited disaster strikes, they know instantly that their moment has come at last. So they didn't have anything to do with its happening. They were just poised. Poised to write the Patriot Act in 12 hours. You ever seen it? Right? They just quickly wrote that because they were praying for a crisis, and it struck. They thought, great, quick, hurry up. Let's get a few people and write that Patriot Act. Right? Now, what's especially remarkable about this is that Naomi Klein knows that the U.S. had actually itself been involved in some of those earlier disaster capitalism experiments in Latin America. It's in the same book. It's about 60 pages later. She talks about how the CIA and ITT worked to destroy Chilean democracy by arranging for the Pinochet coup. She writes very intelligently about this. That it wasn't like the U.S. was praying for a coup in Chile and then acted with chilling speed to take advantage of it. That coup was their doing. She knows this. What I therefore conclude, and this is now a direct response to what you said a moment ago, is that Naomi Klein just doesn't want to go there. I don't think it's a calculation. I think it's an instinctive thing. You go there, you are off the reservation. You are basically asking to be shot, metaphorically speaking. It's professional suicide. You're asking to be Gary Webbed. You know what you understand? Gary Webb was, his life was destroyed by the charge of conspiracy theory. And I know journalists personally even journalists who've written about some of the major conspiracies of the last 30 years, they become anxious to the point of belligerence if you talk to them about this stuff. They don't want to go there, and it upsets them to be asked to go there, because on some level, being serious journalists, they know that they should go there, right? But this has been such a successful effort to stigmatize a particular kind of necessary investigation that our journalists across the political spectrum have been disabled by it, And I've seen it with, election fraud. When Michael Moore, another friend, announced right after the 2004 election on his website that it was not stolen. Just wasn't, So the question becomes, how do we deal with this? I know a lot of people on the left, colleagues at NYU, staunch left people coming to this event who don't even know some of the basic stuff about what the 9/11 truth movement has unearthed. They have never heard it. It's like it's in a bad part of town and they would never go there. They just have stayed away. So they'll ask a sort of fundamental question that just leaves you gaping. And you have to reinvent the wheel and tell them all the stuff, And sometimes they'll, yeah, wow, that's interesting. But that's the end of it. They won't then become interested enough to devote attention to it and circulate, because it's disreputable. It's disreputable. So that's the challenge here.
It's not for polite conversation.
No, it's not. So that's. I'll stop there.